As we were saying before we started, this project is very different than most of my academic work that I've done. It got started kind of for two reasons. A very US centric, actually, reason for starting intellectually was in 2016, socialism, which we thought was dead as an intellectual idea, at least in the United States, was back and popular again. It was right on the heels of a presidential campaign where one of the Democratic candidates claims to be a democratic socialist and nearly won the election. It was also at seeing polls coming out of young people asking them what their favorite economic system was, and more of them favoring socialism than capitalism. So we wanted to do something that was different than our boring academic journal articles and try to reach different audiences. The other reason was my co-author on this, Bob Lawson, who is at Southern Methodist University. He, oh, somebody's not on mute. Uh, he wanted to go get drunk in Cuba, and my wife didn't really just want me going on vacation with him. So I said, I've got an idea for a book. I don't know if we can pull this off because it's writing in a very different style than we usually do. But let's go to Cuba for a while and we'll write it up and give it to normal people and see what they think. And if it gets a good reaction, well, then we can outline the rest of the book. And that's what became Socialism Sucks. And it actually wasn't originally subtitled Two Economists Drink Their Way Through the Unfree World with the beers on the cover like that. That actually evolved as we were writing it because it's a Anthony Bourdain style firsthand travel log that accurately describes what we were doing there, and there was a fair bit of drinking in it. But it turns out that the alcohol in the book actually works as a metaphor for how economies are functioning. Of what's going on in that industry is indicative of kind of the wider economic trends. So it ended up evolving into this eventually. So here's the tour that we do in the book, and India is not on there, and I'll save any remarks about India until we do the guided discussion here. Because if we had done a second edition, we were considering adding a chapter on India then. So tour goes through not socialism in Sweden, starving socialism in Venezuela, subsistence socialism in Cuba, Korea, China, Russia, Ukraine, the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, and then we end it back in the USSA at the largest socialist conference in the United States. I think probably since I'm only talking for about 20 minutes here today with you before we do the questions, I'll mostly talk about some lessons from Venezuela and Cuba, and maybe a little bit on Georgia, and I'll be pretty light on the rest of it. And Pushkar and Anshu can draw out whatever they want in Q&A from those. But first, we need to define our terms here. So socialism means something. It meant something to Marx. It meant something to Lenin. It meant something to numerous economists over the last 100 years who have debated how socialist economic systems work. So it means abolishing private property in the major factors of production. Your factories, your resources, and for that matter, your labor, you are part of the means of production. Instead of them being private property and privately owned, there has to be some form of collective ownership. Now, in practice, for any large-scale society, this means de facto state ownership and control over the major factors of production. But you can have smaller-scale socialism, things like the kibbutzes in Israel, which again would have gone into a second edition. But also even just your family is a kind of socialist unit that actually does something along the lines of from each according to their ability to each according to their need. I have a high school boy at home. He gets all sorts of snacks out of the closet. We don't have a market where we charge him each time he takes a snack. Instead, we fill it with things and then we allocate to people kind of as they need. But notice, by the way, that the family unit, for the most part, isn't a productive unit. It's a consumption unit, which is very different. And you're out each selling your labor in the marketplace where it is private property and then doing a collective sharing at home. It's a huge mistake to take norms of small group social settings and try to extend them to the larger social order where the same incentives and information are not there. In the family, everybody basically cares about each other, loves each other. That's not true across the bigger society. And for that matter, the informational problems that we have to solve in order to organize our consumption are trivial compared to the information problems required to organize production across an entire society. So with that as a working definition to get started, de facto, basically state ownership of the means of production for any large scale society. If you're going to replace private property, which generates prices, profit and loss, and generates the information to coordinate our economic activity and incentivizes us to serve our fellow man, we have to replace it with something else. There is no just socialism from the bottom up or let the workers decide. Because what if the workers at a tire factory make 16-inch tires, but the workers at the rim factory make 18-inch rims? We need some way to reconcile this. In markets, prices would do this. Shortages and surpluses would incentivize people to change. Without that, someone else has to be in control. And that usually means state central planning of the economy, replacing market coordination through prices and entrepreneurial decision making with a central plan. So, with that in mind, Sweden is not a socialist economy. So, this is one that's popular for people in the United States to say that they favor democratic socialism like Sweden or Norway or basically any Scandinavian country. But they're all very capitalist countries. So, my co author, Bob Lawson, he is also the co-author of the Economic Freedom of the World annual report, which basically ranks countries on a scale of 1 to 10 of how economically free you are. For our purposes, if we want to say it, basically on a scale of 0 being complete socialism, 10 being complete capitalism, where on the spectrum one falls on that. And by the way, there's never been a completely 100% private property capitalist economy, and there's never been a completely 100% collectively owned economy. Probably the Soviet Union during war communism in the early 1920s, before they put in the new economic policy, or China under Mao and the Great Leap Forward. Those would be the most complete collectivizations. But when we look at this with Sweden, they're the 27th freest in the world. They're basically a free market economy that's just not perfectly free. And where aren't they? They have a big welfare state, and they have to have big taxes to pay for their welfare state. But those aren't the same thing as socialism. Now, they do have economic consequences. Sweden was very free market from the mid 19th century to the mid 20th century. It grew rapidly, becoming, I believe, the fourth wealthiest nation in the world. And since it put in its big welfare state, growth slowed, and now they're in the bottom half of OECD countries for per capita income. I think that's a problem, but I think reasonable people might disagree about having a large social safety net and high taxes with slow growth, or vice versa. This is very different than the trade-offs you face of capitalism versus socialism. So let's say a little bit about Venezuela, because I think this is the most interesting recent experience with something that's socialism or near socialism. So I want two big lessons that I'm going to want to take away on this one is one, how did it look prosperous? And two, the relationship between political freedoms and economic freedoms. So it's not an accident that almost all examples of socialist countries throughout history have been totalitarian dictatorships. Venezuela was kind of an outlier. So Chavez came to power in 1998. He had tried to come to power through a military coup, originally went to jail, got out of jail, but then he was democratically elected in 1998 in what was basically, as these things go, a free and fair election. International observers certified it. He was reelected running on a platform of Bolivarian socialism after Simon Bolivar, the revolutionary during independence from Spain, and put in a new constitution implementing these policies. And in the 2000s, in the United States, this was the example that everybody who liked socialism pointed to. They said, look at Venezuela. This is successful democratic socialism. So it's not a dictatorship, and it's doing well economically. And if you looked at just the statistics, it did kind of look okay. So incomes were going up, child mortality was going down, poverty was going down, literacy was going up, and people said, see, this is successful. Except it wasn't actually its own economy that was making it a success. So Venezuela sits on the world's largest oil reserves. What was happening to oil markets in the 2000s? Big demand, in part from your country, growth in India and growth in China, before we've had the fracking revolution that radically increased oil supplies. This pushed oil prices up. As a result, Venezuela, remember, government ownership of the means of production. The government owns the oil and the oil company. The government was exporting oil, earning a lot of foreign exchange, and importing goodies to give out to its people. This wasn't internally socialist prosperous. So when you actually look at this, and some of my colleagues here at Texas Tech have looking at what should Venezuela have been doing, you can basically create a weighted average of other countries that are in Latin America or produce oil and see what they were doing prior to 1998 and sync up that weighted average to perfectly measure what Venezuela is doing. And then we could say, after they get socialism, how does this basket of countries weighted average do compared to Venezuela? Basically creating a fake Venezuela to compare the real one against. And what they find is, well, incomes went up in Venezuela. They did not go up as much as they should have. Uh, and while mortality went down, didn't go down as much as it should have. Basically, they underperformed on most of these margins. And interestingly, they didn't overperform in inequality either. So it was really actually what they uh, did improve on inequality, but without improving as much on incomes, which means what they were doing was destroying the top of the distribution without raising the bottom up relative to the counterfactual. Um, Now, eventually, oil production, actually, so government ownership of the means of production, the state ownership was corrupt and putting the wrong people in power and not incentivizing reinvestment in capital correctly. And as a result, the oil production, even though they sit on the world's largest reserves, production went down. And then in the early 2000 teens, when the fracking revolution fully came on, oil prices went down. All of a sudden, they couldn't import enough. They couldn't earn enough foreign exchange to import. And as a result, you have the humanitarian crisis that we see in Venezuela still today. Um, when we visited in 2017, which we were on the Colombian Venezuela border and went into Venezuela illegally for a little while, but we're mostly observing, as you can see, this thousands of people every day crossing the bridge into Colombia, either to immigrate, as you see in the top when they're going into the official checkpoint, or to just buy basic supplies, which you can see in the bottom right, and lugging it back to Venezuela in their luggage and suitcase. And if you look at this, uh, these are not, and you in India have seen differences. This is not your impoverished people. This was Venezuelans who were middle class, upper middle class workers who had some resources where they could still get out here and buy something. And it's indicative of the clothing they're wearing and the luggage that they're dragging. You don't see this from the truly impoverished in poorer countries. The truly impoverished in Venezuela were losing weight and starving. I think the average Venezuelan lost something like 17 pounds in the year that we visited. They didn't all of a sudden discover diet pills. This is an economy that can't feed itself. And in fact, throughout the 2000s, when it appeared to be prosperous, food production in Venezuela was actually collapsing. It's just they were importing food with the foreign exchange from oil. So, first lesson takeaway from Venezuela. It was not successful socialism economically. It was unsuccessful. It was just that that lack of success was masked for a while because of the big oil reserves. Second lesson, Venezuela is no longer politically free. So he came to power in democratic elections and was popular for a while. But since this humanitarian crisis has been going on, so Maduro is his successor, and they have ceased to be democratic for quite a while. This summer was the most dramatic example. In the most recent election, the government just basically told them what the vote tally was and allows nobody to verify it and see any records from it. And the opposition candidate was widely expected to slaughter Maduro. And instead, it shows Maduro overwhelmingly winning. This was true in the last election too, but they were doing things like if you work for a government company, you're ordered to vote for the regime or you lose your job. They'd put food aid out by polling places, and if you vote correctly, then you get food aid. But now it's just outright fraud of making up what the elections are. And in fact, in between these two elections, the legislature had appointed an interim president, Guiardo, I believe was his name, as they're constitutionally allowed to do. And the military and Maduro just said, no, he's not coming to power. So democratic socialism has ceased to be democratic and is becoming mere socialism. And I would say this is not an accident. I mean, thinking about the economic outcomes in Venezuela, they have the world's second highest ever inflation rate. You have people losing weight. Usually, if you have high unemployment and high inflation, that's a good way to get kicked out of office. If you have hyperinflation and people starving and a huge refugee crisis, how is it that you actually win an election? So this is a problem with democratic socialism. So usually you see economic freedom in the economic freedom and the political and civil sphere tend to go together. you see some outliers, places like a Hong Kong or a Singapore that are economically free but don't have political freedoms. The ones that aren't economically free but politically free, those are the really rare ones. And Venezuela was that very temporarily, but soon it lost its political freedoms. And I'd say that this is not an accident. Given the information and incentives of a socialist economic system, you're necessarily going to stagnate your economy. And when you do, voters would kick you out of office. If you allow that democratic process to work, your country will cease to be socialist because they'll vote in a reformer. Or since you have monopolized control over the means of production, you can punish your political opposition economically, threaten their economic livelihood, and take away other freedoms. And you cease to be democratic and you remain socialist. And that's what Venezuela is today. So let's talk about Cuba a little bit. And this is what started the book project, and it's also the best place in the world to go around and see a functioning, dysfunctioning socialist economy, where we can see differences in incentives and information and how it changes economic outcomes. The a lot of things in Cuba, as you spend time there, things seem a little bit off, and the trick is kind of figuring out why. And it's not that because Cuba's poor, but it's because they're centrally planned, seeing the difference between these. So let me give you a few kind of just mundane economic transactions pictures and talk about differences between market incentives and socialist ones in centrally planned Cuba. So when we first went there, we stayed at the Hotel Trinton, which was open in 1979. It has that centrally planned style architecture. You can see it's considerably less gleamingly white in the picture we took when we got there. You can also see, if you look carefully, a bunch of broken windows and glass up near the top. You can see the height of the building. When we get there, there's 4 elevators. You can see the SER going across one of them. 3 of them are out of service. And in fact, they didn't have a record of our hotel reservation, which, by the way, you can't not use American credit cards in Cuba. So we had to book with a British company who pays them on their behalf, on our behalf, and then tells them that we have a reservation, which they said no reservation when we got there. We solved this by handing them money. Go to a hotel room. It's missing panels in the bathroom. There's mold on the toilets. We stayed in another one, Hotel Carib in downtown Havana. This one is on the coast in the suburb of Havana. Hotel Carib is in downtown near the seat of government. And you can see the glass that comes out of the sanitary bag that's not actually sanitary, holes in the towel. If you look at that toilet, you can see the bolt is missing on the seat. So if you get on it, you kind of just like slide, which if you make a mess, it's nice because they left you the previous guest soap so that you could clean yourself up with it. You've all probably had the experience of staying in a hotel and waking up and having no hot water because everybody was using hot water at the same time. I certainly have. What I hadn't until I stayed at Hotel Trinton was experience a hotel with no water at all. Woke up one morning and there was no water. Turns out in Cuba, musicians earn about the same amount as plumbers. As a result, playing music is fun and there's plenty of musicians, but you get a lot of clogged drains and toilets because no one wants to do that shitty job. Contrast that with this is what they call casa particular. So people who have a right to live in their apartment, they don't have a property right in it to sell it the way that we have normal property rights, but they do have an attenuated property right where they can rent it out for profit. So you can rent people's private residences. This is a 2-bedroom. You can kind of see the 2 doors going into a bedroom, 2 bedrooms, kitchenette, living room in downtown central Havana. And we booked it on Airbnb, which is impressive again, because your credit cards don't work, but also the internet basically doesn't work in Cuba. But what most Cubans have is relatives who live in Miami who list their properties on Airbnb, and you pay their relative in Miami and they call their relative in Cuba who actually is there to meet you when you get there and is at the door. And this Casa Particular was very nice. You can see it's well kept. It had hot water, good air conditioning, great location. Why the difference? And by the way, in terms of price, the hotel was about 65 US dollars. That's about the same price as this 2-bedroom Casa Particular. What's the difference? Well, one of them has a version of private property rights where they retain some profits. As a result, they reinvest their meager profits for upkeep. and try to attract more customers. In the other one, no one gives a damn. As a result, things deteriorate and nobody cares. Just a difference in incentive doing the same service. Look around Havana for some other things. So top left corner, this is a busy commercial street. Pause and look at it for a second. What's missing? Obviously cars, but this one's a pedestrian street, so I'll get to cars in a minute. But there's no signs. I've been to plenty of countries, plenty of poor countries. There's always signs. Why aren't there signs in Havana? Government ownership of the means of production. All the stores are government owned. No one gives a shit if you come in. In fact, if you're a customer, you're a mild inconvenience. So why put a sign out to encourage you to come in? In fact, this made it tough because Bob and I tend to just walk around, observe things, interact with people, and then grab a beer and then repeat. And we'd get to a street corner and would look. Any place that sells a beer down there? I don't know. Only way to find out is to walk down the street because there's no damn signs. Go to any other country in the world, no matter how poor they are, you'll find signs. In fact, the beer company will give a place a sign to put out in front if they're selling their beer. Next one, store on the upper right. What's wrong with that picture? This is a well-stocked convenience store. Note, by the way, I'm taking a picture from the outside because it's illegal to take pictures inside the stores. That's a well-stocked one. What's wrong? Well, when you look, there might be 24, maybe, distinct items. Everything's the same. There's one type of cola. It's kind of down there on the bottom. I called it Commie Cola. That wasn't its real name. But there's only one type of cola in all of Cuba. There's kind of one type of each product. You know, in the United States, Bernie Sanders, the politician who calls himself a democratic socialism, he'll say things like, capitalism is wasteful. Why do we need 17 types of deodorant? And most people will be like, yeah, I only use one type of deodorant. Well, yes, but there's 17 other people who use different types. But for a lot of goods, we value variety. I value being able to have different beverages. In Cuba, there's only two types of beer, Bucanero and Cristal. They're both about 4.5% alcohol and taste like an American Budweiser that you left out in the sun a little bit too long. There's no variety. Why is there no variety? Well, one, the central planners don't care. They're just trying to deliver product. And two, they don't have the information of exactly the product variety type mix that market prices generate. So they're simplifying their economic problem of trying to just produce product category instead of granulated, differentiated products within that category. And this comes through in your consumption in Cuba. These bottom two pictures are private restaurants. So there are plenty of state restaurants and they're god awful. But there are private ones. So again, this is on the continuum. Cuba's pretty far on the socialist end of the continuum, but they allow various types of market transactions and private property. And one of them is in restaurants. Originally, I think you had to have 8 seats or fewer. I think now it's like 50, something like that. And the private restaurants, just like the Casa Particulares, their incentives are right. They're trying, but they're dealing with the state supply chain. As a result, every private restaurant has about the same menu and about the same prices. There's about a dozen to 18 different things you can order, and they're all bland. Cuban food in Miami is delicious. A Cuban sandwich there is fantastic. A Cuban sandwich in Havana is a shitty ham and cheese. There's essentially no spice to anything. So they try, but they're limited by the state chain. Last thing I'll end on Cuba with this is their cars. This also illustrates you have private property in cars. Now, they'll say that the U.S. has a blockade, but there is no U.S. destroyers preventing anybody from dropping off Kias in Cuba. It's the Cuban government who limits imports of cars and allocates them as political favors to the elite so that everybody else has to use crappy old cars. As a result, prices go astronomically high. In a country that has probably, and I say probably because income statistics in a socialist country aren't accurate, probably somewhere around $2,500 to $3,000 per person income. A crappy Renault, like is in the front of this picture, would go for about $30,000, about 10 times average income. Those old 1950s cars, which is in the background on this, is more like about 15,000. So in Cuba, if there's a theme of what things you can sell in markets, it's the price is wrong. And it's because they're not integrated into the international price structure. So I think I've used up most of the 20 minutes talking about those countries, which is perfectly fine by me. Because with North Korea, we have to go up and down the border with China. We didn't really go in. Part of the instructions from our wives was we weren't allowed to get killed or imprisoned while doing this book project. And I run a free market institute, and Bob runs O'Neill Center for Economic Freedom. We're not exactly friends of the state of North Korea. Um, but I will give you just one picture from it, because, by the way, the contrast between North and South Korea, this one is, it's rare where you have a natural experiment of same people, same history, same language, same culture, same geography. And one of them gets an economic system that's mostly capitalist, one gets one that's mostly socialist. And 60 years later, you can look at the development differences. And this picture says it all of South Korea is lit up and prosperous at night. North Korea is dark and poor. And in fact, that's exactly what you see from your hotel room when you're there. This is in Dandong, China, in the northern border. You can see in the top left the three arches kind of going over a bridge. Uh, that's the same picture in daylight to the right. And you can see the lights you see on the top left picture are all in China. Across the river, across those three arches is all dark. But you can see with light, there's actually a 300,000 person city here. It's the major export city from North Korea. But much like the satellite, it's completely dark at night. Um, why don't I, Pushkar and Anshu, want me to stop there and you can guide the discussion and weave in any of the other countries in the book that you want?
So I think you can continue for a while on Korea and then we can take over with the discussion.
Well, I'll just sum up with Korea that so at the end of the Korean War, the whole peninsula was decimated, right? Uh, the North Koreans had driven the South Koreans all the way back to the bottom of the peninsula. Then the US intervenes, drives them all the way up to the Chinese border. Then China intervenes. They end up with a peace at the 38th parallel. The entire peninsula is decimated. And North Korea adopts a socialist economic system. South Korea adopts a mostly capitalist one that eventually gets some more democratic freedoms, although things were sketchy there this week of what I'm reading. Um, and See it play out. North Korea today has an average income of probably $2,000 or less. In the 1990s, when they lost Soviet aid, more than 1 million people starved to death. Um, Meanwhile, South Korea has per capita incomes around $40,000, is rich, prosperous, well-functioning economy. Um, there's your natural experiment. If you want a natural experiment, you don't compare the Soviet Union and the United States because there's a whole bunch of other things that are different between them. But in the Korean Peninsula, you've got a place that's pretty much the same, two different economic systems, two drastically different outcomes. And I will I guess, wrap up there. That's a short version of Korea, but that's fine. And we can talk about China and if we want to talk about reform, Georgia, when we're having a discussion. So I'll escape out of here.